Hi, thanks very much, Oksana. And everyone, it's so good to see you. So on November 13th, my topic is, my title, After the Fire, Fossil Capitalism Beyond Combustion. So on November 13th of this year, just a few weeks ago, at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, Rebecca Schultz, who's the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas for the province of Alberta, which is Canada's major oil-producing jurisdiction and well-known as the site of the Athabasca oil sands, announced a $40 million initiative by the state agency Emissions Reduction Alberta, or ERA, called the Advanced Materials Challenge, that's aimed at funding research, development, and commercialization of, quote, first-of-kind projects that shape the circular economy and create low-emissions products, including concrete, plastics, food, wood, carbon material, chemicals, and more. And prominent among the technologies being promoted by this program are those that are aimed at, quote, creating non-combustion products from bitumen. So the development of non-combustion products from bitumen has been aggressively supported by a parallel initiative of the state agency Alberta Innovates, the Bitumen Beyond Combustion, or BBC program, as I'll call it, which is described as, again in quotation, a strategy to transform bitumen from oil sands utilizing the carbon in a value chain of advanced materials and products instead of releasing it through combustion in transportation fuels. And since its inception in 2016, the BBC program has funded nearly 60 research and development projects focused on converting the heavy fraction of a barrel of bitumen to things like carbon fibers, asphalt binder, and advanced carbon materials for use in things like batteries. So the BBC projects combined provincial and provincial and federal funding for these initiatives, reaching something like $600 million by 2030. So the first question that comes to mind, at least for me, is why? Why would a government in a place like Alberta invest hundreds of millions of dollars in public funds to support the development of products derived from the raw material of bitumen other than fuel, at a time when the oil industry continues to produce and sell heavy oil from bitumen for refining into fuel in record volumes, generating record revenues and profits, right? A time when, as a recent headline in the Oil and Gas Journal confirmed, oil rises as missiles fly. Time when demand for Alberta's heavy crude at US Gulf Coast refineries appears to have no ceiling. Why, under these conditions, would anyone invest in something as quaint as hockey sticks made of carbon fibers spun from asphaltenes extracted from the bottom of a barrel of bitumen? The tempting answer is that it's simply greenwashing. Initiatives like this are Potemkin villages cynically constructed to create the impression of energy transition and environmental responsibility, when in fact there's none. What Dominic Boyer, our colleague, might describe as a kind of gerontocratic performance of green petropolitics aimed at securing the regime of fossil fuels by feigning openness to other possibilities. That is to say, maybe bitumen beyond combustion is nothing more than ideology, to use an old-fashioned word, or magic, to use one we heard this morning. Maybe. But we are exploring an alternative possibility. When I say we, I refer to my collaborator on this project, Dr. Hannah Tollefson, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Environment, Conservation and Sustainability at the University of Toronto. So our field work over the past few years, and these images are images we've taken in labs in the field around the oil sands. Our field work over the past few years, interviewing public officials and scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs, doesn't suggest to us that this is a cynical enterprise at all. To the contrary, we've found that those involved in these initiatives see the future for which they are working as real, as necessary, and as divergent from the present fossil fuel economy in meaningful ways. This suggests that the alternative possibility that programs such as the Advanced Materials Challenge and the Bitumen Beyond Combustion program point to are not mere ideology, but instead elements of what we're describing as a material strategy aimed at rehabilitating oil sands bitumen as a resource under projected conditions where its conversion to fuel is projected as being no longer commercially viable. Or to phrase this differently, a strategy to ensure that bitumen continues to be convertible to commodities capable of generating exchange value by materially transforming its use value. It's important to note that these initiatives are not being led by the so-called Big Six transnational oil firms who currently dominate extraction of bitumen from the oil patch for fossil fuel production, and whose appetite for innovation is really just limited to technologies for the capture, utilization, and storage of upstream carbon dioxide emissions from oil sands production. This stands to reason. Carbon capture technology assumes and enables continued production of oil sands bitumen for fuel, right, which is central to both the revenue stream and the market value of those Big Six firms. The BBC initiative, by contrast, is predicated on a future in which continued production of oil sands bitumen for fossil fuels becomes uneconomical under global net zero scenarios, a prospect which no CEO of a major oil firm operating in Alberta's oil patch could admit, right? And the Big Six are currently not having any trouble making money from processing and selling bitumen for fuel, which they will continue to do until the bottom falls out of the market. And so preparation of a potential future for bitumen in a post-fossil fuel, but not post-fossil context, has been externalized and socialized, deferred to the provincial and federal state agencies and their public money. This is consistent with the long history of state support for technological innovation in the capitalization of the oil sands resource, and more broadly with the customary function of the state in capitalist economies, especially resource economies. As Alyssa Battistoni has recently written on this theme, the state is, quote, particularly important as a mediator between abstract capital and concrete nature. Referring to James O'Connor's influential account of capitalism's self-destructive tendency, the so-called second contradiction of capitalism, wherein overproduction generates ecological liabilities that threaten the conditions of production itself, Battistoni observes, quote, the degradation of the conditions of production tends to cause a crisis for capitalism which must be resolved in some way. In resource economy, the state plays a central role in resolving the second contradiction because, as she observes, the state does things that capitalists themselves cannot. The state, therefore, manages capitalism's access to the conditions of production, end quote. So we're considering the possibility that something like this is underway in state-led initiatives to develop non-combustion uses for oil sands bitumen. What the Big Six oil companies of the oil patch cannot do is stop extracting bitumen for conversion into fossil fuels, or admit to a future in which that commodity is no longer economically viable. For this reason, they risk destroying the conditions of production on which the resource economy of Alberta and much of Canada is based, and they risk squandering the massive resource that is the bitumen deposit of the Athabasca oil sands. A contradiction and a potential crisis to which the state and a range of affiliated kind of avant-garde scientific and commercial actors is responding by admitting to and seeking to engineer a future that fossil fuel companies structurally deny. A future in which bitumen is no longer viable as a feedstock for fuel, but in which it is rehabilitated as the material basis for other commodities. Thus, BBC and related initiatives represent an effort by the state to do what oil sands capitalists themselves cannot do, secure the conditions for continued extraction and commodification of bitumen long after it becomes useless and valueless as fuel. Phrased differently, this amounts to a strategy for a continued fossil capitalism whose defining attribute is not the production and consumption of fossil fuels, but instead the continued commodification of fossilized materials, the core purpose of which is ongoing reproduction of the commodity form as the organizing principle of relations between human beings and between humans and other sorts of beings and things. This would be a fossil capitalism that's perfectly consistent with transition to renewable sources of energy rather than ended by it. Electroculture, as Dominic Boyer calls it, sure, and maybe no more fossil fuels, but not no more fossils. The scientists and engineers we've been speaking to refer to the raw bitumen that they work with as precursor. We've been approaching these initiatives with this word in mind, treating them as a precursory intervention aimed at securing the conditions of bitumen production, a response in advance to the contradiction that threatens to undermine those conditions of production. Bitumen beyond combustion is an anticipatory remaking of this resource, a complex program of specifically material rehabilitation that's continuous with a long history of refining oil into diverse commodities, such as we learn from Matt Huber's work, the unfolding nature of oil's role in petrochemical empire, as we learn from Adam Hanier, and consistent with the future of a petrochemical planet, Alice Ma. So, as Adam Hanier writes in his recently published book, Crude Capitalism, eco-critical writing on oil tends to emphasize the upstream segment of the business, the exploration and extraction of subterranean crude reserves. This is certainly true of nearly all critical work on the oil sands in Canada, which overwhelmingly focuses on the dispossessive and ecologically devastating effects of bitumen extraction. Hanier suggests, quote, to look instead at what oil becomes once it is pulled out of the ground, in order to gain, he says, a better understanding of what oil does for capitalism. He adds that doing so, quote, also reveals the crucial role of the industries, infrastructure, and workers that enable oil to move, to change, and to be consumed. Ships and ports, refineries, chemical firms, banks, financial markets, and so on. Each of these sites plays no less a part in the story of oil than the struggle over prized reserves located deep underground. Thus, we have been studying the sites and forms of mediation by which oil sands bitumen is composed and recomposed into social forms and material relations, which is to say, into commodities. This has led us to develop analyses, a range of analyses along a number of lines. Some of you will have heard some of these other analyses that we've been doing. So we've been looking at the elemental mediation and manipulation of the chemical properties of bitumen as a carbon-intensive material. We've done work on the logistical and infrastructural mediation and resource formatting, as we call it, involved in storing and transporting bitumen for non-combustion uses to market. We've studied the discursive and symbolic mediation of these emerging resource formats and commodities, including their technical representation in things like patent applications and speculation kind of documents. And we've looked at their integration into the emerging political economy of green capitalism in Canada. We've been tentatively characterizing all this as, to use a phrase we also heard this morning, the real subsumption of oil sands bitumen, a qualitative recomposition of the resource that will enable its exploitation when simply producing more of it for use as fuel reaches its limit as an accumulation strategy. We emphasize mediation here, not only because we're media studies scholars, but because it's impossible to think our relationship to and through materials without considering the forms of mediation that enable those relationships. We recall here Andreas Malm's crucial line in Fossil Capital that no lump of coal nor any drop of oil has yet turned itself into fuel. right? This suggests that fuel is not the ontology of oil or bitumen, that the becoming fuel of these materials is a historical contingency that required and requires mediation, and that therefore these materials could become or be turned into other things. A fact, again, that's amply demonstrated by the parallel history of oil as the precursor to a dizzying array of petrochemical products. This reminds us that resources are made, not found, and that their materialization as things that take the form of commodities requires complex technologies and practices of mediation. So, like Mom, we're interested in what it takes to turn a drop, or a blob in this case, of oil into a resource commodity under historically specific conditions. In this case, the emergent conditions of climate change and the onset of green capitalism, transitional conditions in which the long-term viability of bituminous oil as a fuel commodity is in doubt. In Fossil Capital, Mom traces the becoming resource of coal under the conditions of emergent industrial capitalism. At a similar moment of transition, we seek to detail the technologies and practices of mediation by which the state aims to reproduce the conditions of fossil capitalist production by remediating its core resource and transforming it into something other than fuel in order to preserve the resource commodity as the form by which social relations are organized in this place being Canada. Fossil fuel might have been what initially defined capitalism as fossil capitalism, but it's the commodity form and the relations it structures that makes fossil economies capitalist. With the onset of the renewable normal, as the After Oil group has taken to calling it, bitumen might lose its value as fuel, but its remediation in commodities whose use and exchange value do not require combustion could preserve its status as capital, that is to say, quoting the famous line, not a thing, but a social relations between persons, which is mediated through things, and thereby extend the life of commodity relations at a time when climate change and energy transition might otherwise suggest alternative ways of organizing social and economic life. The BBC program and related initiatives respond to a projected decline in global markets for Alberta bitumen as an emissions-intensive fuel source over the next few decades in the context of various prominent net zero scenarios. They hinge on chemical and mechanical reconfiguration of bitumen, changing it from a source for fossil fuels that generate unwanted carbon dioxide into a source of valuable carbon products and commodities whose end uses do not require combustion and whose transportation and storage are both logistically reliable and environmentally safe. This entails developing formats for transporting and storing bitumen in solid phase, not liquid phase, which reverse the normal process by which heavy bitumen is diluted to produce liquid formats suitable for transport by pipelines and in tanker ships. Reformatted as a solid material, typically in granular or pelletized formats, bitumen can be transported overland and across water in standard shipping containers by rail, truck, or ship, without the risk of slicking, saturation, or ignition upon leakage or spill, optimized for logistical flexibility and stable stockpiling proximate to sites of use. In these solid phase granular formats, optimized for non-combustion end uses, the carbon intensity of bitumen arising from its high asphaltene content converts from an economic and environmental liability into an asset. In its most recent report, Alberta Innovates projects total annual revenue from non-combustion uses of bitumen under an aggressive global net zero scenario at $100 billion per year by 2050. That's about equivalent to what they make now producing fuel. This strategy corresponds to what Adam Hanier has described in his work on petrochemical empire as the situation in which we relate to oil, quote, as no longer an energy source, but as a feedstock, the literal raw material of production itself, which he describes as decisive for the future trajectory of fossil fuel use, in which, as he puts it, what was essentially waste, in this case, the asphaltene-laden heavy ends of a barrel of bitumen suddenly become an indispensable component of circulating constant capital. It's also an example of what the critical geographers Daniel Banub and his colleagues have described as commodity transformation, a tendency that emerges in resource industries when the accumulation strategies of commodity widening, that is to say, producing the same commodity in the same ways in greater quantities in many locations, or commodity deepening, producing the same commodity but in more productive or efficient ways, when these reach their political or ecological limits and their efficacy as techniques for generating continuing or added value declines, resource firms turn to commodity transformation, which involves the active reconstitution of commodities in an effort to realize greater value in exchange by crafting different forms of commodities than those with which the material is originally associated. So, working with that idea, we argue that in cases of commodity transformation, such as the reconfiguration of bitumen for non-combustion uses, the form of commodities changes while the commodity form remains intact. Or to put it even more precisely, our argument is that the concrete form of commodities is changed so that the abstract commodity form remains intact as the organizing principle of social life at moments when material conditions arise that could otherwise destabilize that principle. Interestingly, Banub et al. Add that the strategies of commodity transformation also rely not just on the physical reconfiguration of the resource, but also the articulation of an alternative symbolic and cultural meaning associated with the resource. So, to close, as if on cue, I read in Canada's national newspaper just this past Saturday an article by David Hubert, who's author of the novel Oil People, with the headline, "Oil is not the problem, burning oil is the problem." Hubert actually quotes one of the gods of petrocultural criticism, who happens to be here today, but Hubert's own reflections are actually more telling for our argument. He says, "We need to rethink oil as a material substance. Oil as a material substance should be regarded more gently. It's benign. It's an amoral substance. Oil in itself is not a problem. Burning oil on a massive scale is the problem," right? Something akin to Diamante and Simpson's argument, oil is not a thing, it is a social relation. Right? The trick, he says, is to develop alternative symbolic and cultural meanings that detach oil from combustion. Imagine a world, he says, where oil was handled with care, where many of the same innovations come to light, but oil is burned rarely, with caution, where petroleum-derived plastics are produced only in the most necessary cases. Recoding and revaluating petroleum could help clarify debates around oil culture, pipeline politics, and energy futures. Bitumen beyond combustion. It requires no imagination. The project is already well underway. Sponsored by a petrocapitalist state whose function it is to secure the conditions of continued production of commodities derived from this fossilized resource. What is notably absent from the imaginary the author alludes to in that little passage is a future in which heavy oil, transformed for non-combustion uses, does anything other than reproduce the commodity form as the exclusive and compulsory basis of social and environmental relations. It's well known that Marx's analysis of the commodity form culminates in an account of the fetish character of the commodity, where it stands in for the historically specific social relations that it simultaneously contains, mediates, and occludes, binding people subjectively and objectively to the structure of those relations. Here, offered in sacramental form, right? One of the solid phase formats for directing bitumen toward non-combustion uses, right? We're confronted with the possibility that bitumen beyond combustion could well save us from the cataclysm of climate change. But continued faith in the body of capital might be the price of that salvation. That's my 25 minutes.
Well, thanks, Darin. I have two questions. One is regarding the ecological toll the extraction of the tar sands necessitates. I mean, I guess this won't change, or what's the answer to this? I mean, I just read that I think it's the most energy intensive and pollution intensive way of producing petroleum in the whole world, which makes Canada also one of the two most polluting countries. So, I mean, this problem won't be solved. And the other thing is, how does this vision differ from the way that the whole plastic universe has, emerged from the beginning, which always was using petroleum and gas for non-combustion means, which always was like 10% or something of the industry.
So the short answer to both those questions is that in a way, like what I hear under your questions, you're right? So the bitumen beyond combustion program will not solve the extraction problem. There are simultaneous efforts in the province of Alberta to mitigate and minimize the environmental costs of extraction, including remediation, all of the kinds of things that we're normally we normally hear about with regard to extractive sites. None of that will change at the point of extraction. At the point of processing and producing the materials, there is a slight dip in emissions associated with that. So the state's strategy here in terms of the environmental profile is that this finally will address the Scope 3 emissions problem, which is the problem of what happens to the product when it goes to the market. So they articulate this as a great net loss in the emission, or a net decline in the emissions profile of the oil sands resource, because in the future being designed and projected through the bitumen beyond combustion project, no heavy oil will be burned anymore. And so you'll have this, like they say, roughly 80% of the emission, even though it's a very emissions intensive process, about 80% of the emissions associated with the product are Scope 3 emissions, which will be eliminated because they're not going to be burned anymore. So that's the rationale that they use for saying that, yes, we will continue to have an environmentally suspect extraction process, but the gain is going to be in taking all that fuel out of the market. Right? And then as far as the second question goes, as I suggested, we see this as continuous with the petrochemical trajectory, parallel petrochemical trajectory of oil's history, right? There's a slight difference here in that while right now the profile in the Alberta oil sands is, as you suggest, primarily production for fossil fuels and about 10% for petrochemicals, this would be massive, this would be like totally reversed in this scenario, right? And again, so it's about taking fuel out of the equation. And not especially for plastic production per se, like if we define plastics narrowly, because here we're talking about carbon fiber production, advanced carbon materials that are not disposable plastics. And so they think they can circumvent the argument around the environmental liability of plastic production and use by directing these materials to not the same kind of uses that we associate with the environmental deficits of plastics. But that's not to say all of that's convincing, right? I'm not an advocate for this at all, but that's the rationale that they present in response to those questions.
Thank you for that great talk. I have kind of two questions / comments. First one is, it kind of seems like complaining at a very high level in that this is required to produce the transformation of Canada possibly getting to net zero, kind of disciplining fossil capitalism. I mean, personally, I don't think they ever should have developed the oil sands anyways. So it's, when you're telling me this, I'm watching, I mean, I live in British Columbia part-time. I'm like, oh wow, thank God that there's some sort of plan, just because on an everyday basis, I have to deal with, you know, people complaining about the carbon tax. So I guess that's, I don't know, I didn't see I felt like this was a great plan. It was great to be informed about it. And then the second question is also kind of about a political irony about Alberta, is that its incredible, almost progressive social class character of being so embodied and working class and the ability to earn money. It's really, I've never really seen anything like it. And there's almost a kind of egalitarianism built within the fossil fuel capitalist sort of, you know, regime of accumulation. So I hope these weren't negative comments. I just wanted to engage this great talk. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is, certainly in relation to your first comment, you know, it's still, one of the things that we've been grappling with in this project is like how to understand a project like this that might not come to fruition. Because like I said, the big six oil producers are not really interested in this, right? So how do we account for where the impetus for this is coming from and what's at stake in it as far as the major investment that's being made in developing this pathway that might not come to fruition, or that might come to fruition only long after all the damage is done, right? And it certainly has all the liabilities, for example, that Alexander expressed. So we're not, like, again, at all champions of this. We're trying to figure out how it works and what role efforts like this play in what are otherwise understood as energy transition strategies coming out of a resource, you know, an oil-rich jurisdiction, and also the green capitalist kind of rhetorics that are emerging for describing those transitions. And so this we see as fitting into that in a very particular way. And in the end, again, like, most people would be happy if the oil sands of Alberta converted from producing fossil fuels to producing carbon fibers and asphalt binder with that massively reduced emissions profile. But that doesn't mean that something else is not being reproduced at the same time. And I guess that's kind of the point of our investigation, and why, and framing it in terms of like the state-led reproduction of the conditions of production and the reinstallation of commodity relations. Like that's really kind of what's driving this. Yeah, and I'll just say, like, on the question of like workers in Alberta, one of the interesting things about this initiative, and a place like Alberta, which is probably not unlike many other oil-producing places, is that even though like I said, the big six oil companies are kind of on the outside of this, as far as the political parties go, and the labor unions in Alberta, they've all expressed considerable support for this strategy in significant ways. Because they see it, I think, as a way of continuing the extractive economy of Alberta under conditions that are lining up to seriously jeopardize that possibility. And that goes for workers as well as social democratic parties and, you know, the conservative and mainstream parties. They all kind of see a possible future in this. Yeah. That might otherwise be slowly being foreclosed by the emergence of net zero strategies.
Okay, I'm up. My questions, one is speculative. I just want to hear your ideas about it. Two are really just about getting more information. When these strategies are being unveiled, do they come with, are they seen as a response to one of the criticisms that have been always lobbied against extraction in Alberta, which is that there's no secondary or tertiary production? Is one of the elements of this that kind of carbon fiber production and so on will take place in Alberta? So that's one question. This is just a point of information. A second is that I think you've alluded to it a little bit in the other responses, but I wonder if what the state is doing here is a lot messier than your short presentation provides. So I'd be curious to hear about that. So what comes across here is that there's a coordinated effort by the state, and it knows what it's doing, and it has a determinate outcome, and unions are on board, and some politicians are all on board, and it's just these big oil companies that are not on board. Tell me more about the kind of the messy gunk that happens internally. So those two articles you showed were from 2020, 2019. So 2022, we get Daniel Smith. And I just wonder, does a certain kind of conservatism and has there been a reorientation towards the big six away from this? Is this a secondary strategy? Is this something there, but it's not seen as the most important thing, so on? And the speculative question is about the second contradiction of capital in relationship to the conditions that can, what conditions can undo it in the response of the state. Pure speculative, Darin, I just want to hear, what is the time horizon of that? Insofar as one might imagine that climate change is that too. At some point it will eat away at the possibilities of capital to do the kind of work that it does. So is it that can't be measured because, why? Is the measurement the quarterly report? Is it the length of a unit of stock? Is it, so I'm just curious, purely speculative based on the kind of things that you've looked at in your project.
Remind me the first question.
I'll have to remind myself. It's about, is there language of production? Right? So it's not just, we don't refine it. We just ship it.
So it's interesting on that question. The primary framework is export of the material. There's some development of processing capacity around carbon fibers in Canada, and but the primary impetus of the funding is to develop the processes whereby carbon fibers could be spun domestically, but then sent for production elsewhere. For example, to produce not just hockey sticks, which is a promotional item, but really to produce vehicle parts that that are adapted to EVs, which are heavy but could be made lighter through the use of carbon fiber technology for battery casings as well as the bodies of automobiles, etc. So all of that is, the fibers might be spun domestically, but they will be shipped as raw material. Same with the asphalt binder, and the advanced carbon materials are not yet at a point of development where that's clear. So it's still a kind of export imaginary, more than a secondary processing imaginary. As far as the messiness of the state's position, this is still, and I tried to convey this, that it's still a kind of marginal strategy. It's still kind of even marginal, it's definitely being financed by the provincial and federal governments more than anything, mostly funding channeled through universities, right, and research and development kind of initiatives. But it's definitely at the margins of the state's priorities vis-a-vis the oil sands right now. They're not like rushing to convert. They also are interested in simultaneously maintaining the conditions of continued fuel production as long as the market remains for that, right? While simultaneously, marginally starting to plan for this other future, right? And this hasn't really changed with Daniel Smith coming to office, who's a right-wing politician, very pro-oil industry. It's in their support for bitumen beyond combustion is in their campaign materials. She's spoken publicly in favor of the initiative, and they've continued to fund it, as well as the Advanced Materials Challenge, et cetera. So it's kind of like, yeah, marginal to the industry, also marginal to the state, but nevertheless, it's the state that's taking care of it. As far as the timelines, I don't really know, I'm not sure I'm clear on your question. The only time frame that they have in their mind that they're fixed on is net zero by 2050. That's the end date or whatever. And so everything is calibrated toward development by that date, which anticipates, so they're trying to sync up the coming on stream of the possibility of a non-combustion productive economy with the shutting down of fossil fuel production. The only other thing that I will add to that, which I think is the bigger temporal issue, at least, and it's not really related to your question, but is the specter of the unfunded liability of oil sands cleanup, including abandoned wells for fuel production and remediation of the oil sands themselves, which is a massive unfunded liability. It's obviously an environmental liability, but it's also a huge financial liability, and it's widely expected that the firms are just going to bolt, and that the only way to get money out of them will be through long-term costly litigation, et cetera, and that there needs to be some kind of industrial base in order to fund remediation of the oil sands and extractive operations when the big six oil firms flee the scene. And this is a big part of how how the people that are working on this describe the time horizon, or at least a temporal aspect of why this is necessary. Yeah.